Improvisation should be the ultimate interpretation. Of course, one plays the written notes, the written rhythms, the written patterns, but the notation leaves so much room for guessing the hints which are suggested as if they were lyrics, breathing for singer or wind instrument player, or bowing changes by groupments of notes. Whenever on the piano, with the pedal or even without, one can play length of sounds that extend the tempo beyond the instrumental limitation, so to say, of a violin, oboe, or voice. It is truly the inner world of the composer's hints that we translate through the piano playing. And therefore, we have to be so invested in the thoughts of the composer that are hinted beyond words, lyrics, breathing marks. I find it even more touching when different pianists, therefore different musicians, express through their playing what they have filtered from the composer's unwritten, in between the lines, text, subtext. Of course, it's very subjective, because no matter how much we can refer to pulse, rhythm, tempo, possibly metronome marking by a number of beats a minute, there still remains this element of floating tempo. Just like in harmonization, there is such a thing as the melodic line. It doesn't have to be on the top. Sometimes it's in the bass line or both, sandwiching the texture of the harmonic expression diluted in arpeggios or even in lesser notes. But the harmonization, if it were to be a coating of the soul, of the thought of the composer's emotional outbursts, either the composer like Chopin looking back into Bach, or composers finding their natural inspiration in their predecessors like Haydn for Beethoven, Schubert finding a lot in Beethoven too. It's not influence, not only. It's more subtle than that. It's affiliation. And Bach, who was an orphan as a child, was thrown from cousin's home to another, and he somehow, like Schubert, in a paradoxic way, when we know his knowledge of Bach's music compared to Schubert's intuitive one, he was self-taught by examples. Copy fugues and copy suites of other composers and learn his trade as an organist, but mostly as a polyphonist. And I find that the texture of the music played on the piano, written or not for it, because of the fact that the piano of today is an instrument so universal, of course, that you can play music not written for it and music written for it, which is something you cannot do with other instruments. They're more the element of fruition of the compositions which you play on. You cannot play a Rachmaninoff concerto on the harpsichord, but you can play a Bach partito on the piano. Of course, it's not authentically right. Of course, it is, in the eyes of the purists, profoundly modified, amplified, or uglified even, for the aesthetics of a given instrument's production of the sound, resonance of the sound, length of the sound, suggested length of the sound when no pedal holding but long values and slow tempi still written. Just like Liszt, Schumann and other composers wrote, like Debussy as well, and Fauré, held notes that you cannot hold, but today with a middle pedal, which they didn't have on their piano. So in the evolution of the instrument, we can find ways to bring out the texture in a more clear and more fulfilled way, as they were suggesting in their notation. Even if they did write, things couldn't be held with 10 fingers. Well, they didn't have the middle pedal for the pianists or no pedal for the harpsichordists. So that means that they assumed, even if you could restrike a held note that was decaying, that, and probably they did, and likely they didn't always on the beat, and that is to the taste of the performer. But nevertheless, I'm convinced that they were not limited by what we consider, because of the piano's longer length of sound, by the short decay and short-lived sounds of the harpsichord, compared to the organ, where the sounds never die, well, except when the guys in charge of the bellows were tired and all of a sudden there was no more air in the pipes for the organ. But with the electricity and the fact that we have constantly pulsed air, yes, we don't have decay. Therefore, the articulation of the detached experience of the notes that are spoken to be like syllables of a spoken text have to be even more detached, especially when organs are, of course, nested in churches, which have with high ceilings and generally very big proportions of space, big resonances up to several seconds of echo. So between too short and too long, for the polyphony of the voice leading with long and short values, on the harpsichord you hear the moving notes and the held notes die, but you know they are there. Restricken or not, you suggest it in a way to delay the note compared to the bass note, to organize the spone melodic line from the bass line, the ground up for the Baroque. And in Romantic era, it seems to be an onwards, something more like a melodic line harmonized, or then ultimately no melodic line and no harmony when it's atonalism. Of course, I am purposely jumping through the time periods in several sentences, easy to say, difficult to imagine, because none of these people whom we serve from the past or the recent present, composers that they were, performers for some virtuosos or not, the piano writing was the expression, or the keyboard writing, rather in the largest sense of the word, was the expression of their musicianship. Was it orchestral version of the piano? Was it an aria imitation on the piano with repeated notes in syllable changes that sound melodic when sung and have to be replayed inside the key in order to give a legato of the repeated note in the melodic sense of the keyboard, which is on the piano hammered by the hitting and the resonance of the string, especially the cross strings on the modern pianos, where the resonance by sympathy is even going on everywhere where we don't play the notes. So it gives such larger and wider and richer in tone instrument. But of course we lose then the differences between the high, middle, or low range, coloristically, like woodwind, strings, and brass, let's say, in an orchestral groupment of family of instruments. And so they have their specificities, not only in volume, but they do also that in timbre, in colors, in thinness or thickness of the sound, in wideness of the vibrato, the expression of the human voice vibrato, imitated on a wind instrument, or then the voice, of course, itself in opera, art song, choir, church music, or storytelling, a simple song, chanson, pop music. All these elements of musical expression are, I think, so incredibly important for us today in the 21st century to humbly look upon. The Ländlers in German tradition, for instance, where Schubert and Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven quote them. You could say it's popular tune. Tchaikovsky himself does that. The Fourth Symphony is filled with popular Russian songs, nursery songs. Brahms's Opus 117, number 1 intermezzo, is lullaby. Now, some people can say, yes, the finale of the 453 G major Mozart concerto was sung to him, supposedly, by a bird. Perhaps not exactly in 4/4, perhaps not exactly in G major. Perhaps there are some extra alterations, but the bird didn't care about tonal rules. But in few cases, one can say that if nature is the inspiration, Messiaen was considered an ornithologist. He studied birds everywhere, especially in exotic islands. And when he heard this, like Clément Jeannequin already, way before, about Le Chant des Oiseaux, the songs of the birds. If music is in the nature and the musicians translate it with a certain, let's say, artificiality to organize thoughts, to organize sounds in pitches, in rhythmic patterns, in up and down beats, in overlapping elements, in loosening through triplets, groups of 16th notes that gives a rhythmic ritenuto. So much can be said about hearing a piece for the first time that strikes you, either because you can comprehend or not all of it, perfect pitch or not, perfect detection of different subtleties or not, perhaps not, but some. And then if you look at the score afterwards, in case you want to study it, you realize that the notation is completely not corresponding, in fact, or very closely not, to what you hear in general. So why is it that people don't play what's written? Well, they do. But there are fingering issues, pedaling issues, stretches issues, single keyboard on the piano. If you have to write chords that have to be arpeggiated, then you lose the rhythm, but you gain the stretch of the display. But if not, you have to bunch the notes, and then you combine voices. Even if you write up and lower stems, you keep singing do, si, la, do, si, even if do holds to si, and si, la, sol, si, la is moving, and you should hear it as well as the held note at the same time as the moving note. So you have to think layered. You have to hear layered. You have to imagine having heard the piece before you read the score. And then when you learn how to play the piece from the score, just like a second, third, or fourth language, which comes from the book compared to the native language, which comes from the ear. The music is a sort of a native language to composers who translate through their most intimate inner world the expression of emotion, hope, despair, love, anger, all what is part of the human experience. And of course, it's obviously filtered by the character of their personalities within perhaps the character of their time period for sure, as well as of the countries from where they come, or the culture rather from which they come. Countries didn't always exist in such national denominations as today. It was always in the past mostly Latin culture in Europe through Christianity, or then eventually the idea that music represents the organization of the gods, of the different sounds, for the different senses like the smell, the view, the touch. And so it was part of almost, what can you call it? Spiritual, uplifting, to express themselves beyond the noises they made with their throats, scream, speak, sing, whisper. So from the earliest times, music was transmitted by oral tradition, therefore, like a child at birth learns the mother tongue by ear. But the other tongues that they learn later, if they do, are by the book with the rules. And in a way, that's what we do in a music score. We read it from the book, but we translate it as if we heard it and it's our own speech. But of course, verbatim is the score, the notes, every detail. We spend our life learning how to play exactly what's written, no matter how difficult it is. Technically, for virtuosity or for polyphony, or even for understanding how to organize the pacing compared to the tempo, because it's not the same. And then where do we allow a rubato to slightly cradle here, there? Is it 6/8, 3/4, 4/4? Whichever meter suggests a Siciliana or a march or a waltz or a minuet or a allemande, or whichever time period dance stylized on the piano, or just a pacing that is not to be danced, just music for thought, not only for entertainment. But combined, you can say, hey, today we have serious music, classical music, as they call it, when there's so many more than one styles, but they took one style to denominate all of everything that's not pop. But in fact, within pop, there are so many different genres. And within classical, there are centuries of styles. But factually, to take an example of a Mozart opera in the late 18th century in Vienna, most east capital of the Western Europe, what happened? There were no pop songs. Ländlers were sort of the country songs for marrying, dancing in villages, of course, unalphabetized people, but of course, through the reform of Luther, the famous printers from Mainz invented a way to bring through German language the gospel to each of the parishioners of their churches, their temples. So they could read it by themselves. And how did Luther think best to organize the spreading of this reform of the Catholic Church? Protestantism was through singing, chorus, SATB choir, church music, to translate the meaning of their true religion compared to Catholicism, singing in choir, the music being part of the breath of the human nature, was part of the gospel, of course, through the voice, through the participation as a group in the congregation in the temple singing. And so you could say the written is there to explain the suggested, the hinted, the evident, or the one that is the most essential to all, faith. And of course, when you read a piano piece which you just discovered by hearing it by somebody, even if that somebody might be one of the greatest pianists, regardless of the opinions of everybody, nobody agrees on everything in these kind of situations because everybody has their favorites. And then when they read the music and you start reading it and you play it, you discover that there are elements that are not brought in usually in what you hear in this piece. So you wonder, why is it? Is it too difficult to bring out? Is it too complex to bring out? Is it too subtle? Is it just avoidable? Is it the pedal that covers too much and we don't hear enough of the inner voicings? In other words, paradoxically, the notation is very complex and not enough sophisticated to define the details of the in between the lines. Naturally, the music that we talk about, and it's so many centuries of it, is music for reflection, prayer, just inner reflection, or translation of an emotion of human experience, joy, spirited fun, humor, sadness, longing, and all that instrumental music without lyrics, though as expressive as if. So they are suggested, just like the long values on the harpsichord are hinted, even if they are not to be restricted. Once you enter in this kind of immersion of a given stylistic period, even through an instrument which doesn't correspond to it, but through which universally you can express, perhaps with a certain difference, and certainly sometimes more than a great difference from the authentic instrumental expression. I still think composers like Bach, Chopin, Beethoven, Schubert, Liszt, Schumann, Scriabin were not defined by the instruments for which they wrote. They didn't define their own or filter or limit their inspiration by the instrument. They, of course, wrote through the instrument, the fortepiano after the harpsichord, the modern piano after the fortepiano, always louder, always brighter, always longer sound, bigger halls, more projection than recording sessions which develop the acoustics to the intimacy where you hear many at the same time, but individually hear the same pianist play. And so you can, with the microphones, capture more subtleties than a concert hall goer could hear from a given row. But acoustically, instrumentally, all these instruments of music which develop through tuning systems and development of the technology of the manufacturing of the instruments, the steel strings and the felt hammers, and then the combination of pedals, the unicorda for the softer or the, let's say, less bright, coloristic, limited compared to an organ or an orchestra, but still it's more like lights and shadows, brings through this the elements of different emotional expressions. It's more like as if the piano hints the orchestral colors, like a black and white photo with lights and shadows, chiaroscuro, like paintings. So yes, it becomes more of a, especially because pianists don't have to breathe and change both directions, the tempi also can become extremely extended, unnaturally slow, or unhumanly possibly fast to even follow them for the listener, let less for the performer to play. But then the piano playing by its own gymnastics is not an end by itself. Just like I think the piano is an instrument or keyboard instrument for which the composers composed was not a limiting instrument. Why? Because they didn't think it was limiting. They were thinking voice leadings, they were thinking layered voice leadings, they were thinking structure, they were thinking organization of tension and releases, delayed resolutions through suspensions, redefining consonance and dissonance in major with the two parallel and alike tetrachords, whenever in minor the fact that the top tetrachord differs from the bottom one created various amounts of superimposition, sometimes willful for expression of pain or emotion, dissonant collisions of these 6th and 7th degree, the famous leading tone, la note sensible in French, the sensitive tone. Music theory has different ways of calling the same things in different languages. That's another way how you name the affects, but then how you understand the affects, let less how you translate the affects to your playing in the piano, which is to do with the touch, the voicing, the flow of the phrase, the groupment of the bars, the pulse, the chemiola in 3/4, that is a 6/8, or the accent on the downbeat compared to the so-called temps fort in French, the strong beat, but in English downbeat, not always strong and not always down. If you start with an upbeat, and the accent or the impulse is not always in the downbeat. And sometimes the composers, like Beethoven in the opening of 109 Sonata, you purposely don't know when you're listening. If you start on the down and upbeat, he prefers to let you just float in a sort of a undefined situation. So there's so much more subtleties that are either hint or either expression. And so ultimately, of course, you can realize that pop music is entertainment, storytelling through very simple or sometimes very harsh words, but part of the expression of a society, of a group of people, of desire to accomplish a statement through music, call it so. Spoken in rap or sung in rock or pulsed and rhythmed in any case, or swung in jazz. And this kind of popular music, in the sense unwritten, jazz is improvised on charts at best, and it should be so. It's different when it's filtered through the mind of a composer. After all, there is as much emotion in a fugue by Bach, a nocturne by Chopin, or a song by a pop singer. It's just filtered through different ways and reaches us at different levels. When Mozart was walking in the streets of Vienna, they say he was very, very, very happy. When people who were, I don't know, street painters or people cleaning windows were whistling arias, well, hit parts of the arias of his operas, which were popular, just like a pop song would be today. So, of course, there is a dimension of, that's why people study classical music, because it's written, thoughtful, organized, complex, structured, measured, more than that, constructed like a mathematical, architectural organization of numbers, spaces. It is the produce of a reflection. It's not only the impulsive response of a musical expression. But also, and I think that is the most important point, is that when you reach the moment where you play the notes which you read, which were written by somebody who have imagined them, organized them, and specifically notated them that way, either because of the tradition of their time, either because of some timeless organization of the pacing of the elements, or the superimposition of the elements, or whatever, without to explain, even if there are sometimes expressions about, andante, walk, adagio, at ease, allegro, joyful, or lively, vivace, or andante, adagio, all these indications, okay, they remain summary. An adagio by Handel obviously is not going to sound like an adagio by Scriabin, so the tempo is not all. And therefore, the decision of the tempo beyond acoustics instrument and personal taste or culture and understanding of the different styles between the French Impressionist symbolists or the, let's say, harpsichordists, I think at some point, either we decide as interpreters to learn how to translate, interpreting is a translation, the music through the instrument we play without to betray it, or at least not in our conviction. And of course there are schools of thoughts and teachers who would say they don't know what they're doing, they're supposed to play it this way, it's too fast, it's too slow, the phrasing is wrong, it's supposed to be played this or that, the ornaments are not on the right position, they should be on the beat before Bach and before the beat after. And we have treatises and we have schools and we have researchers for centuries now that we can trace to tell us how to play, how to think a similar type phrase that you can find. Already C.P.E. Bach, Bach's second-born son, wrote an essay about the expressive performing on the keyboard, of course, harpsichord. And then subsequently fingerings, they didn't use so much thumbs, or if they did, Bach used them on two keyboards of the harpsichord at the same time to develop even more polyphony on the organ as well. But the keyboard of the piano, most of the time, not to say all the time, is single keyboard. So then we have to do fingerings which, in order not to be blurred by the pedal, which is there for harmonic purpose, the right foot pedal, and we cannot stretch more, we have to find ways to finger pedal, and then we teach ourselves or teach our students how to use more of the substitutions to sort of multiply the fingers from 5 to 7 or 8 if you need them, so that the textures that you translate through your playing are with clarity. Then comes the quality of the legato, connected, non-legato, air legato, detached or just articulated compared to non-articulated, which would be more blurred, overlapping, overstaying, a legato that is note over note. Then you have the delay release of the preceding note, and if it's a tone or semitone, passing tone, you have a dissonance. If it's a third, you have a chordal organization by thirds, so that then all of a sudden your melodic line, like in the opening of the Appassionata, is an arpeggio, do, la, fa, la, do, fa, la, do, fa, fa, do. And you could think, is this thematically striking? I'm just playing an arpeggio, therefore a chord, therefore not but a statement of where I am, tonic of F minor. It's sort of, the thematic material is normally a motivic element that you recognize, just like the gaze of somebody you love, or somebody's smell in terms of their fragrance, or perhaps the fragrance of a garden, or the fragrance of a candle, or then the gaze of somebody who you love, even if they departed, and you still remember how they looked at you. And I think all these elements cannot be really notated. And so when people play, they play what they think is hinted in the notation. And because we are so afraid, wrongly or rightfully, we're so afraid to be not doing the right thing. What would be the right thing? Authenticity. original text. Of course, even if we read the, and not always to be able to find them, but nowadays more available than ever, when not lost by time, fire, wars, we have scores from their own handwriting. Then we have educated editions of music scores by scholars who bring us in modern notation and clear edition typeset on the score. You play the piece, but then since we played outside of the time frame in which it was composed, as well as for those who played or those who heard them, we hear them differently today, or perhaps misunderstand them, and perhaps enjoy misunderstanding them, even when we are aware that the authenticity is not there, instrumentally or hearingly, tuning, distance, acoustic resonance, how we display the music in space, recorded or acoustically performed in which kind of halls, and therefore the pedal, the phrasing, the articulation, all the essence of the music expression has to be reimagined. I don't think it's per se that we are traitors to the original thoughts of the composers of the past whom we serve in our present. I think in a way we reach a point where we reach a moment of truth. It becomes our music, individually to those of us who played, even if it's shared by many for the famous pieces like a ballade by Chopin that everybody who has technique can play, and then therefore displays differently the rubato, the ritenuto, the transition between this theme and the other, the organization of the coloristic hope in relative major and return sadly in minor with a half diminished seventh. And then you feel like all these elements of learning are not there to suppress the intuition of how the music speaks to you through the sounds that are produced, read or reproduced by ear, like the oral tradition of folk and pop music. Simple as it is for a pop song or a Schubert song harmonically, but in that simplicity lays the poetry. Or complex as a six-voice, rare, richer car, if not single, of Bach, which is organization of the thoughts. And this, the mathematical organization of thoughts in the Pantoum of Ravel's trio. And so we can organize the very elements that touch and move us, that we translate through our playing, as if they're our own. Of course, that's why at the beginning I mentioned, isn't provocatively so, improvisation the ultimate interpretation? Well, that's what I think. If not, you seem to recite words in which you don't believe much, but you recite them so well that people could start believing that you do. In the English tradition of theater teaching, they speak about rupture of disbelief. That's when you know that they're telling you a story, but you want to believe in the story which their acting embodies. So the pacing of the words, the gaze, the way the given actor puts in their own persona the words of the text. Of course, the text words without which there is nothing, they cannot replace them with their own words. But when they say them, and the way they say them, you realize that you forget that they recite something they learned. They give you the illusion that they are the character that they're depicting through their persona. And I think the same thing happens with music. You have to immerse yourself so much in the elements which are constitutive of the piece which you play. And once you've learned about and studied by curiosity or by obligation their understanding or the organization of the thoughts for the notation, and what they speak to you about what is behind and beyond what could have been notated. And then you start believing in the piece, it becomes part of all your own life. Because through life you play it, you teach it, you organize it by, let's say, recording it or write articles about it and become convinced about it. And people sometimes start thinking you're a specialist of it. It's all very relative terms because I think it's to do with lack of humility. In fact, I think ultimately, even if knowledge is the only way, intuition is the indispensable way. And keeping the balance of the two is the only way to be believed by a listener. Would the listener be super knowledgeable or completely not knowing the piece? You address them at the same time. You address them by the humanity, literally, experience of life that comes through the music pieces which you play, where you have the expression of emotion combined with the expression of reflection, with the expression of essential movement, would it be dance or just pacing, expression of enjoying details like this or that coloristic harmonization, this dissonance for that consonance, these delayed resolutions that give you a sense of sort of floating. You don't know it, you don't put words to it, but you feel it. You're sort of psychologically, as a listener, manipulated by the composer's musical interruption of the original silence and the final silence, and in between, with a lot of silences too, is the expression of the meaning of what they bring to you. So descriptive or not, most of the time it can, it should, it could. Sometimes it is. The birds, the nature, the emotion, parting, returning, restarting, hoping. I find that ultimately piano playing will forever be less specific than lyrics, and at the same time more universal than human language in its translations. How can you translate a poem that you put in music? How can you translate lyrics other than if you speak the language? Because the words you choose, as daily as they could be, are part of a music of the language in which you write those words, to be spoken, to be sung, to be read silently in one's head, to be felt, just like I think when Bach wrote music, he wrote it in voices that are organizations of their thoughts, as if they had their own. But Bach's organizing them, a bit like his many children, polyphony in everything in Bach, but not per se in the single instrument, because in a way he wrote through the instrument, the organ, the harpsichord, and we through the piano play or hear or reinvent or revisit the intimacy of a whisper, the might of an anger, the expression of driven, unsettled syncopation of life, as if the music we hear that we play on the piano outside of lyrics, outside of orchestral or drums or any other instruments, is sort of the pure soundtrack of life, as if playing in our own heads, not to have to be even expressed, brought out from the Latin ex out. Impressed, when you receive from outside, the impression in from the Latin inside. And therefore, you read the music, you're impressed, you play the music, you're expressing it. And so you become the membrane between the piece, that you receive through the written score, and of course the teaching about it that you receive, and all these other elements of knowledge, plus how to play all the notes, which fingerings, which organization of tempi will allow this at best, and what you try to reach, and how you hope to have the technique to play it at a certain tempo, but then you can't right away. So it's a progress of life. It's why I'm saying I feel like music for pianists who are very loners, they practice always alone, unlike quartet musicians, orchestra musicians, they benefit from each other in real time when they bonify their own selves. Pianists are loners, they practice alone, they play alone. Chamber music and concerti are the rare moments where they can share their musicianship and therefore the different ways of producing the sound combined with string or winds for pianists. But generally when they practice, the pianists are alone for hours and years, all life. And in a way, the music plays in their head after they practiced, and the music stays in your head. It doesn't have to be expressed, therefore, sung, whistled, played, performed, orchestrated, screamed, organized in ways that it's translated through sounds of nature. It's artificial organization of the sounds of nature, but it's to express the human nature, or at least how humans imagine the nature, or the nature of being human. So it's a poetic way to express so many of the purest hopes of humans, the elevation of the spirit that we all, willingly or not, attempt to. Sometimes unwillingly, sometimes denyingly. We can find the worst in ourselves and the best in ourselves. But the tempers and the personalities and the characters and the situations in which we are thrown, unaware why we were born there, now, here, there. And when will that end? And meanwhile, we discover the nature, the people, the ways, the goodness and the badness. And I find that all these things are part of the musical experience, which goes through the filter of the notation of a composer who we play verbatim, not for note. But at the point where when we play, it appears as if we are making it up with our own words, free prose. And reciting a poem that sounds like free prose gives you the illusion that you're not only reciting words, you're giving the meanings of the words to touch and reach our hearts, our souls, wherever that is. But it is inside us. It's an intimate interaction between a thought, an emotion, and ourselves. And I think music is an alternate universe, an escapism, if you want, that brings us closest to what we cannot find words for. The creation, the flame, the soul, what makes us alive, hurting or enjoying, painful or hopeful, driven or tired, hopeless or... all this is in music. So if it's an escapism, it brings us to express it as if it is our life that is expressed through somebody else's life centuries ago in a different paradigm completely so. But somehow the few notes notated on the score represent something universal that we can identify with ourselves today. And that's when the performing of this music becomes as if improvised, in the sense that you learned it, you studied it, you practiced it, you repeated it, you detailed it, you did it in every possible detail, separate hands, two hands, counting, not counting, with metronome, without metronome. You try to harness and then break the mold to just remain in the essence of what it expresses. And so if you can reach the moment where you play the piece which you practiced repetitively, so that when you play it is like life, when you play it without restarting or doing just sections, but you play it through. Just life's chronology, life's seasons. And I find that, of course, that's what makes interpretation so uniquely emotional, because it's never twice the same in terms of details, even among the same performers, even with the same conviction about the piece, without to have, aesthetic disagreements for which then they position themselves in different points of where they should be in the piece, or how they should bring out the piece, from the notated text to the living humans. Bringing to life those signs on paper. Saying the truths or the pains or the emotions or the thoughts that are embedded in the pieces of composers long died ago. Yes, they're dead, but while we play them, they're alive, timeless. Of course, you are a law. You study the styles. You understand that a Haydn and a Rachmaninoff piece is different in terms of the way they organize their thoughts, the expression, even if they use the tonal system as a backbone that is with the hierarchy of the tonal systems, chords, creating a tension release or delay release by the deceptive cadence before the perfect cadence, or perhaps a plagal cadence without the tension of the leading tone and the tritone that creates the necessity for realization through a resolution. Tension, release, delayed, all that. One shouldn't reduce the different stylistic expressions through time, or even within the same time period between different composers, even from the same country. Ravel, Fauré, Debussy have a lot in common, being French, but in their music without text and without lyrics, therefore. I don't think they're that alike. Let less music by Frescobaldi compared to music by Stravinsky. And why is that? Why is it that we in classical so-called music of the past, even if it's in our present, we bring alive all these tradition styles, genres? Nobody dances minuets, but we play them anymore. But we still play them because they're stylized, or waltzes in Ravel compared to the waltz that was danced, let's say, in Vienna. But of course, we don't play them for what they are. We play them for what they bring us to be in. Escapism, yes, but closer to our inner connection to music. It's the poetic aspect. The sounds for the sounds, just like the words are chosen for their sounds as well as for their hints in a given language. You can translate a meaning of a poem, but you don't translate its flavor. You can describe a food to somebody by saying this and that, but they have to taste it to realize the combination of those tastes. Of those ingredients that bring to taste it exactly like this. I think those infinite subtleties of perception, the tongue, the ear, the touch, the eye, and of course they close all, and it's inside you, it's the soul. And in fact, we all crave for soulful music through pop or classical. At which level we want to be, of course, entertained, as the word says it itself. Classical so-called music is often entertaining, perhaps not in a ha 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 way, but in its own spirited way. There are different levels of humor and there are different levels of expression. And I'm sure that what I observe for all these years that I play and teach music is that all the young people of their generation, when they come to study, in fact, in today's life, what do? They dance on pop and rap and whatever pop music is in the style of their day, while they play this eternal music of the past is their conviction, pastime for some, and professional hope for others, because it's so beautiful to devote your life, if you can financially afford it, for what you love, rather than to work something that makes pay the bills, but that doesn't mean anything to you, and then do it on the side, regardless how we organize ourselves for that, or how we accept or not what it takes. We are essentially in a timeless place. Often when I was a child, I thought thematic materials and all, but ultimately it's a time machine. Classical music, as they call it. You can spend your day in the 18th century, a little bit in the 19th century, through the notes, through the elements, through the hard work on organizing your muscular memory, your cognitive knowledge of independence of fingers and all. So you're not constantly thinking of the time period in which you are supposed to be immersed even by proxy, but nevertheless. And I think that if young students who are training to become best classical music performers are still spending entertaining time dancing the pop, rock, rap, folk, whatever it is, entertaining, dancing, singing music of the day, they still play and practice music of another day. And they don't find any problem in that. Sort of the escapism in the one, and then the social connection with the people of their time around them. I mean, there is no young musician who can date or have acquaintances with people of their generation. And if they say, I'm a classical musician, usually most of the people would say, really? You're weird. But you like rock, right? And that's true. Why not? I don't think it's incompatible at all. Unfortunately, the other way around isn't always the case. But who's to know in the inner world of Elvis how much he knew about Bach? Or the inner world of a rap singer that is an expression of poetry through their own paradigm, their own time, their own claims, their own distrusts, and their wanting to express through the words that they pace angrily or rhythmically in that sense. They are poets of their time. Who's to know in 2, 3, or 4 centuries from now how people will perceive rap music in history? Just like today, when we hear some chansons of Jeannequin from the 16th century, we have to plunge ourselves in that language of the time. The French of the time is not this today. And then you enter into another way to understand why they were using these elements of expression between the tones, the notes, the pitches. It's so sophisticated and complex, but then how they organize them to marry the syllables of the words. So who studies these? Musicologists, music scholars, who want to teach and write treatises about given music from different time period, geographically as well, specifically, become specialist of a Monteverdi madrigal compared to, I don't know, Scriabin fantasy. And you realize when you study music that there's so much that you'll never have enough of a lifetime to cover in depth everything. So then you restrict yourself, so to say, by necessity, to the essence, and you say, oh, I love romantic music, or oh, I like modern music, or I like atonal music, or I like Baroque music, or I cannot stand I don't know which music. And just this approach of choosing by this triage that you develop the sense for brings you closer to what you want to express in music through your own being, the thought, the making, and the thinking of how you make it. So one thing is to read it, another thing is to learn how to play it, memorize it, organize it in your thoughts, become part of your own being. It evolves through life with you. Oh, I shouldn't have played it so slow when I was young. In fact, the real tempo is this. And it took me so long to realize I was wrong in the approach of the piece, either because I was taught so and then I regretted the way I was taught, or either I didn't understand what I was told and I couldn't do it. But now, 20 years later, I finally understand what they meant when they were telling me, think about it this way. These things are so incredibly humbling, because it shows that you've never reached a point where you know what the piece is. No. You keep wandering. You explore your daydreaming. You bring yourself closest possible through practicing repetitively until you manage to cognitively embed in your muscular memory all the details that have to come out when you display the piece chronologically, like life itself. And it doesn't come out twice, because inevitably you practice often, one practices often sections, fragments, and putting them together is not just an obstacle course. It's more about reimagining life from A to Z. You play Schubert sonata beyond the factual elements of the music itself. It brings us to daydream as listeners or performers. Well, we should be more careful not to daydream too much when we perform, because we have to perform. Conductors don't play, orchestras play. Pianists are the conductor in the heart and in the head, as well as the orchestra in the fingers. So there is this gymnastics to play the piece, as well as necessarily some kind of spiritual connection, a poetic connection, perhaps something that is beyond words, even if they were to be lyrics. They call it universal language for music is because generally the tonal system is universal. Tension, release, dominant, tonic. Okay, you can go way more subtle than that. But even with 3 chords, you can do a Bach song, 1-4-5, the tonic, subdominant, and dominant. In comparison to a motet by Thomas Tallis, with voice-led inner voices that speak to each other like inner thoughts. That's what they are. While the melodic line and the bass line are quoting them. And when you play that on the piano, written or not for it, they call it transcription, but in fact it's beyond that. You play through the piano because the instrument allows you polyphonically, with the pedals on top of it to multiply the fingers and the hands. You obtain a certain versatility through the instrument to play a requiem as well as a sonata, in an opera, be it hinted, obviously, but call it transcription. I think it's mostly a restatement. You can play The King of the Forest, Erlkönig, Schubert's song, in a transcription for violin alone, of course, if you can play the violin to be able to. And you can play it with a singer and a pianist, or you can play it on the piano itself. So, of course, its original purpose is an art song, is to set poetry in music. And if you take out the element that makes the poetry the transmission of the word, with all the meanings that are beyond only its original meaning, the symbolism that's attached to it, the elements of expression that are hinted, the piano playing, if you play it without the words, because you have to, in a way you speak through the articulation, the way you delay a note, the way you bring out a note, the way you ornament or decorate, and it's not the same, but you combined perhaps, the way you delay it, the way you displace it compared to the bass note, the way you dislocate it to bring it in a certain way by punctuating in your phrasing as if a spoken or sung situation occurs, repeated note, melodically so. I think the power of suggestion that is embedded in the performer pianist is phenomenal. And this beautiful, meaningful, because beautiful is so subjective, meaningful is a little bit more objective. If you define what the meaning of a sonata is, beyond the form, but then the contents. And in the contents you find the meaning of the expression, but the organization of the thoughts in Haydn or Scriabin sonata, of course, is not the same, to say the least. And then, of course, ultimately the breaking of the form or overboarding from the form. Ravel used to say he admires Haydn because he expressed so much within the form. But composers like Beethoven started breaking Haydn's form, not to mention already during almost Haydn's long life, to his probable dismay. But I still think that it's not the question, it's the answer. Because inevitably we are faced with questions. How am I supposed to play? What does it mean? How will I bring it out? How can I choose what to bring out in the score from the music that I read, from the music that I hear, from the music that I can play? Independent voicings in order to bring out this or that? Are they meant to be combined by the composer? Did the composer hint that they are supposed to be ambiguous because they're so close in range that they could be in a combined melody or independent layered voices? Do I want to bring out something by lights and shades? This way the listener is directed by my playing to hear this or to hear that. But then, in fact, I reduce the piece perhaps through my own filter. So how not to reduce the piece by ourselves, how to restitute what we think is the grand gesture, the spacing, the phraseless, or the barless, or the... Of course, they're organized in the notation group of bars, but they're always group of bars for a phrase, a sentence or two, a run-on sentence, a sentence with or without climax or towards a climax, and then after the relaxation or not. And some music don't need it. And the chromaticism, colorization, chroma, Greek for color, and the tonalization because of the organization of the tones in a given tonality, they give us some kind of coating of the soulful expression. So they hint us that is complex. They hint us that is mysterious with diminished sevenths. And they hint us that major triads are supposed to be some kind of plenitude. You've reached the harmony, the organization of the consonances without dissonance. But is plenitude consonance? Not always. The human nature of our being is that we have a brain that can make horrible things to each other, as well as most marvelous things to each other as humans. And through history, we go through museums, and we always look at the works of art of these people while they all lived in horrible war times at any time period that we visit in a museum devoted to this or that century of this or that country. And what do we visit? The artworks they produced. Who? The artists, the dreamers, the poets, the painters, the sculptors, the writers, the philosophers, the thinkers, perhaps even the commoners of every time period, regardless. Of course, you learn in history the battles and the tolls and the horrible massacres of populations for this or that conquest, possession, and it is part of human nature, obviously, to be bellicose. And then there are those who see beyond and above, even in their short time life. And you think, oh my God, this painting represents the world to me, even if it's only what it is from when it was. And you say Da Vinci, of course, and Le Nain, and Van Gogh. Of course, you recognize them today as different styles, but in fact, they were immersed in their time, and so was Beethoven and Schubert and Chopin and Brahms. And were they in the escapism of their own time too? Probably. Do we reach that escapism when we reach to them in order to express what it could mean to us? Of course, you could compose your own, you could improvise your own, or those who are interpreters play what is written of the other, but they do it with such conviction that people who don't know tell them, hey, I liked your piece, or I liked your song, assuming all music is lyrics. But let's say to call it piece or song is a bit of a specific thing for professionals. But in other words, the impression that has to come through your performance as a pianist is that you make it up on the spot, and that's why you're believed. The rupture of disbelief of the English theatre school, the listeners, even if they know it's by Beethoven or Schubert or Mozart, they think it's by you. Well, they lure themselves that it's by you. You make them believe it's by you. So is it just all illusion and lure? And do I take too much freedoms with the score to make it mine? Mademoiselle Boulanger, when I was sight reading music as a child next to her very old lady, it was just an amazing moment because I was so much discovering music that she was rediscovering 70 years later. And I was just, oh, why didn't Bach do this? Why did he do in D minor book 1 the answer tonal, not but real, when most of them are tonal? And I even wrote as a child for a lesson that was not a task to do, a version of the fugue of D minor book 1 with a tonal answer. And she asked, and she was perhaps amused, perhaps aghast, perhaps she thought I was, well, I was only 10, so, but still arrogant, perhaps. She told me, prepare yourself to love the music you play. If you don't understand it, don't reject it. Don't say I don't like it, say I'll try later. But nevertheless, if you play it like at the best you can of what is written, of what is supposed to be meant by the composer. And if you don't like it the way it is, write your own. I didn't shy. But that is separate from interpretation, composition. And then in turn, if others play me as they do, I'm so lucky to hear how others revisit my music by their interpretation of what it meant to them, regardless of me in terms of personally, but through the notation of the score. In Nuance's way, in terms of expression, not dynamics only, it's different from the way I would have done. And perhaps the composer has I am a one. I just don't know how the others, but I know that the interpretation is part of the composition. It comes in all one, in one out of oneself, so to say, when you lay it on a music written score. But it shouldn't be, and it I don't think should be reductive, so that only my interpretation, because I'm the composer, is legitimate, and any other points of view, tempo, phrasing, articulations, and different ways of expressing the piece are wrong because they're not mine. I don't own my interpretation. I am humbled and blessed when my music means so much to somebody to express it in turn to others. And I still think that, of course, interpretation is to play the notes, translate them literally. And to compose your own notes is to express what lays inside you, not that you received from outside you. It comes from inside out. Of course, it's filtered by the subconscious, it's filtered by the influences, it's filtered by what you play. If you play a lot of Debussy, you end up writing a piece perhaps closer to Debussy because your soul and your spirit is immersed in a given composer. Couperin, Ravel, Schumann, Mozart, and the lesser known ones, Dupont, and many more, who were not to be as famous even if they were very inspired. It's nothing to do with it, but the fact is that we are also here to bring to light, when we love a given music, if it's not famous, to bring it to hopefully more people to enjoy it. It's equally important is to play the ballade by Chopin that everybody already knows before you start playing when they go to a concert, let's say, if they are, if not all, the music lovers. And you still can make them rediscover it differently. They can dislike it, or they can be surprised and say, I never thought of it this way. Depends of the people, but then, of course, you're restating something that is already so defined. You have to sound as authentically close to the detail of the text as if the expression of it comes because it means to you. Not because the crescendo is marked at that bar, but because in the flow of the events, in the musical expression of the development of the formal elements of the piece, you bring it to become that. You don't arrive to the climax too early, or you delay, you organize, so you have some kind of strategy, but within that you have the expression of what you want to bring it. It's about life itself. It's about the soundtrack of life when you perform music.